Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the half-fae Father Seeker, Kellan the Kid. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee or through my Game Nerds affiliate links in the description. Also, if you aren't currently aware, we're running the channel's 20k subscriber giveaway as of the posting of this video, link in the description, so feel free to go and check it out if you'd like to enter for a chance to win a deck featuring the Gitrog Ravenous Ride, as well as additional accessories and upgrades for it. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Kellan the Kid is a 3/3 human fairy rogue with flying and lifelink that costs Bant and has the following ability. Whenever we cast a spell from anywhere other than our hand, we may cast a permanent spell of equal to or lesser CMC from our hand without paying its mana cost. If we don't, we may instead put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. Breaking down his core stats, this version of Kellan is sporting a relatively lightweight CMC, an average stat block for his cost, alongside keywords that make him naturally evasive and capable of padding our life totals as he gets in for damage, and possesses an ability that can generate us a huge amount of value in the form of free spells and land ramp so long as we stick to non-traditional casting. And value really is the name of the game when it comes to Kellan, as being able to potentially get 2-for-1 value out of every single spell we cast is massive. That said, there are some clear limitations to this value, such as only being able to cast permanent spells off of his ability, thereby forcing us to rely on slower sources of interaction, and us needing to have reliable ways to cast spells from outside of our hand in order to proc it in the first place. Though thankfully, Bant has quite a number of ways to work within these confines, either through its large selection of adventure creatures who still give us access to flash speed interaction while being permanent so we can cheat into play with our commander, or plenty of spells with built-in mechanics that let us cast them or others from non-hand locations to reliably proc Kellan's effect. So, as we can see based on his ability, Kellan is a commander that incentivizes us to go all in on non-traditional casting in order to outvalue our opponents. So in this build, we'll of course be running a sizable selection of adventure, Foretell, Suspend, and plot cards to reliably proc this value, ways to cast cards off of our and our opponent's decks to give us even more ways to trigger his effect, and a good number of cast from exile or outside of our hand payoffs to generate us even more value as we do so. But seeing as we can't win games through value alone, we'll also be including a wide array of evasive or trampling on theme creatures for us to rapidly build up our board through that value and pick apart our opponents with, providing Kellan with a gang of reliable damage dealers to crash into our opponents alongside him until they fall both before them and our insane value advantage. So let us make our way to Thunder Junction yet again, this time deep into its uncharted deserts where we'll find Kellan and Amalia surveying and mapping the land. It had been about 2 weeks now since the heist at the vault had gone sideways, with his father Oko and his gang having been betrayed by Vraska and Ashiok, or rather Vraska and Jace, and now he was back to where he started, with his father having disappeared to parts unknown and him being left with more questions than answers. Still, it wasn't all bad. Akul was gone, blowing up along with the rest of the vault, and his Hellspur gang was in shambles, freeing the people of the plane from his tyranny. And as for Kellan, he was done wandering for a while, stealing a quick glance at Amalia as she remained engrossed in documenting every detail of the land before them. Maybe, just maybe, it was finally time for him to settle down. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Opening our creature base with a suite of creatures with adventure that we can use to provide both utility as non-creature spells and proc our commander as we recast them from exile, we have Brazen Borrower, whose adventure side functions as a decent instant speed-bound spell that later comes down as an evasive body for us to swing in with alongside our commander. Sapphire Dragon, which provides spell disruption through its adventure and again comes back as a decent-sized evasive beatstick, this time as one that provides repeatable card selection as it swings in as well. Storm-Killed Vanguard, whose artifact and enchantment destruction may be at sorcery speed, but whose big body that can't be chump-blocked makes up for it as another way for us to reliably get in for damage. Kellan Inquisitive Prodigy and Beanstalk Giant, each of whose adventures can add us extra lands into play, the former by giving us an extra land drop as well as a clue, and then functioning as a flying threat that can repeatedly destroy our opponent's artifacts as he swings in, and the latter by tutoring a basic land from our deck into play untapped, and later coming down as a gigantic beatstick that only becomes stronger as we grow our land base. Illithid Harvester, which synergizes nicely with its own adventure by first tapping down a scalable amount of creatures for 2 turns, and then turning those and any other tapped creatures into vanilla 2/2s to deal with troublesome board states. Woodland Acolyte and Tlinkali Hunter, both of which allow us to recur cards from our bin to be used again, the former returning any permanent from our bin to the top of our deck, which it can then draw for us on the same turn when it ETBs, while the latter is limited to only creatures, but makes up for it by being a huge trampling beater that also lets us cast 1 creature from exile for free each turn to drastically increase our tempo. And lastly, Twinning Twins, whose adventure is a serviceable piece of protection to keep our commander or other high-value creatures alive against removal and wipes, and whose creature side is another decent-sized evasive body for us to keep growing our force of flying creatures with. Then moving on to some creature entries we can instead foretell in order to cast them from exile as well as to cheat on their mana cost, we'll be running Green Slime, whose ability to disrupt our opponent's artifacts and enchantments at flash speed makes it quite an effective piece of back row removal. Sage of the Beyond, which gives us access to another large evasive body and also provides a sizable discount to any spells we cast from outside of our hand to speed up our game plan considerably. Battle Mammoth, which is instead a big trampling threat that provides a measure of spot removal protection by allowing us to draw if our opponents target our permanents with any of their spells or abilities, which at best forces them to look for easier targets, and at worst at least lets us replace the card we lost. The Foretold Soldier, whose compelled 1 creature block and big stats make it a decent source of pseudo removal as it attacks, while it constantly foretelling itself when it takes damage allows us to net multiple free spells and or land drops off of it as we recast it for 2 throughout the course of the game. And, as our last creature with built-in foretell, Glorious Protector, which we can use as a flash speed way for us to protect our board from a wipe, or simply as another evasive body for us to deal damage with alongside our commander. We'll then also be running Ethereal Valkyrie in this category, which may not have foretell itself, but can foretell other cards as it ETBs and attacks, enabling us to cast cards from exile which we would otherwise be unable to, usually at a considerable discount, while also allowing us to dig deeper into our deck for more resources. Our creatures that use plot to cast themselves or others from exile are then up next, those being Slickshot Lockpicker, which can trigger Kellan twice if plotted by granting an instant or sorcery in our bin flashback for twice the value, as well as letting us reuse the spell itself, and Fibblethip Lost on the Range, who instead lets us plot cards off the top of our deck, making him a non-themed source of repeatable card advantage, and the first of many sources that can take advantage of our top deck to let us cast spells from outside of our hand. And finally, as our last pair of creatures that use specific keywords to let us cast them or others from exile, we have the Legend Emoti Celebrant of Bounty, whose built-in Cascade and passive ability to tack on Cascade to all our CMC 6+ spells nets us even more free spells and triggers off of Kellan as we bring her and our considerable number of high CMC spells into play, as well as Deep Sea Kraken, which we can suspend early and comes online quite quickly as our opponents cast their spells, eventually netting us a sizable body with true evasion and a free CMC 10 or less spell off of our commander. Now, switching gears onto creatures that allow us to cast spells directly from our deck, we'll be slotting in the Reality Chip, Augur of Autumn, and Cemetery Illuminator, all of which allow us to cast spells off the top of our deck to some extent, the first letting us cast anything once it's reconfigured onto another creature, the second being limited to playing lands at first, but eventually letting us cast creatures as well as we grow our board with different power bodies, and the last slowly accumulating different types of spells we can cast off the top top as it exiles cards from graveyards, making them all solid sources of repeatable on-theme card advantage. Rashmi Eternity's Crafter, who functions as another source of either free spells off the top of our deck or draw as we cast our first spell each turn, either of which we're fine with as additional value. Jacob Hawken Inspector, who starts off as repeatable card selection, but eventually we can use our considerable mana base to turn him into a passive source of free spells or land drops off the top of our deck each turn to build up our board state even further. And one more legend in the form of Durin of the Yawning Portal, who lets us exile a creature from the top 4 cards of our deck every time he swings in that we can later cast, generally at a -3 discount thanks to granting that creature Undaunted to both technically provide us with draw and ramp. And then as one last pair of flying entrants that allow us to cast spells from exile that don't quite fit into any of our other categories, we'll be adding in Ojir Paddock, Deepest Epoch, whose ability to grant rebound to our instants and sorceries not only lets us get extra uses out of a good portion of our removal and ramp sources, but also lets us cast the creature side of our adventures for free on our next upkeep as added synergy, and Dazzling Sphinx, which instead lets us cast instants and sorceries from our opponent's decks as it swings in at no mana cost to keep generating us a steady flow of spells to proc our commander with. So, having covered all our creatures that can cast themselves or others from outside of our hands, let's pivot onto some legendary payoffs that work alongside our commander to empower and or benefit from those spells doing so. Those being Doc Arlock, Grizzled Genius, who functions as a cheap way for us to cast all the spells we have in exile at a sizable discount, Vega the Watcher, who instead tacks on draw to every spell we cast from outside of our hand to ensure we have spells and lands to cast and play off Kellan's effect, and the 13th Doctor, who distributes +1/+1 counters onto our creatures as we non-traditionally cast our spells to make our commander and other evasive and or trampling threats even more dangerous as they crack in, and untaps them on our end step on top of that so they can use their newly acquired increased bulk to intercept attacks for us. And then wrapping up our creature base with another pair of legends that are more focused around generating us generic value that just so happen to synergize with our game plan, we have Chulane Teller of Tales, who makes use of our larger than average creature base by netting us more draw and land ramp as we cast them, as well as being able to quote-unquote reset our adventure creatures by bouncing them back to our hands so we can make use of their adventures again if we need to, and Tetiova Benthic Druid, who instead makes use of all the extra lands Kellan brings into play for us to generate us more card advantage to reload our hands and life gain to pad our life totals. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instants. Unsurprisingly, returning to non-traditionally cast spells as we enter our instant category, we'll be adding in an array of Foretell cards to our arsenal to further fuel our primary game plan, such as Depart the Realm as a cheap and effective source of permanent bounce to disrupt our opponent's boards with, Saw It Coming as a non-theme counterspell to disrupt our opponent's plays with or to protect our board from destruction, Behold the Multiverse and Surge of Brilliance as solid sources of card advantage, the first essentially being a scry 2 draw 2 for 2 if foretold that can net us a free CMC 4 or less spell off of our commander, while the second can easily reload our hands thanks to drawing us a card for each spell we cast from outside of our hand that turn, including itself if we foretold it. And, last but certainly not least, Cosmic Intervention as a way to protect our board from wipes, ensuring that our board of evasive and trampling creatures comes right back into play the turn it's destroyed for only 2 mana if foretold. And then as a suite of more traditional spot removal to disrupt our opponent's boards with to close out our instance, we'll be slotting in Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares as some cheap and efficient sources of non-destruction creature removal to help us deal with our opponent's creature-based threats, along with Beast Within as a more expensive but much more flexible piece of spot removal that can deal with almost any type of permanent threat our opponents can throw our way. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Even more alternatively cast spells will be joining us as we enter our Sorcery category, starting off with some spells we can suspend in the form of the ramp spells Search for Tomorrow and Venture Forth, both of which provide the build with on-theme land-based ramp, the former by being a basic land tutor, and the latter by randomly putting a land from our deck into play, and resuspending itself when we cast it so we can get additional ramp and procs off of our commander on subsequent turns, as well as the draw spell Inspiring Refrain, which also resuspends itself when cast to provide us with not only a quote-unquote free draw 2 every 3 turns, but also netting us a free CMC 6 or less spell off of our commander every 3 turns as well for even more value. Then as some more spells we can foretell to cheat on their cost and proc our commander with, we have the removal spell Raven Form, which provides rather decent coverage for what is functionally a CMC 1 spell by providing non-destruction removal for creatures and artifacts, while its gifted flying token won't do much against our army of flying beatsticks, and the board wipe Doomscar, which will generally serve as an on-theme 3-mana way for us to wipe the board, leaving us with plenty of mana left over to start rebuilding before our opponents. And then as one last source of on-theme card advantage, we'll be slotting in Make Your Own Luck, which lets us plot a card from our top 3 while putting the other 2 into our hand, potentially netting us a spell at a considerable discount that we can use to proc our commander, while simultaneously getting us more cards into our hand that we can then cheat into play when he procs. It's then going to be ramp all the way down for the remainder of this category, with us slotting in the staple land ramp spells Farseek, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, 3 Visits, Cultivate, and Kodama's Reach to both speed up and fix our 3-color mana base with the best ramp spells our colors have at their disposal. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. All our enchantments this time around, in some way, shape, or form, allow us to cast spells from outside of our hands to help enable our primary game plan, such as Elven Chorus and Case of the Locked Hothouse, both of which let us cast cards off the top of our deck, the former allowing us to cast creature spells off the top while also turning all of our creatures into mana dorks to give us even more mana and fixing to work with, while the latter eventually lets us play lands and cast creatures and enchantments from the top, but does require us to get to 7 lands first, which shouldn't be an issue thanks to our land ramp package, our commander, and it itself granting us an additional land drop each turn, as well as one with the multiverse, whose gigantic mana cost is well worth it by allowing us to cast anything from our top deck, and, on top of that, lets us cast a free spell from our deck or hand each turn to cheat out even our biggest spells. Spells like Mind's Dilation, which may be a do-nothing 7-mana enchantment, but starts generating a serious value in the form of free spells off our opponent's decks as soon as they start casting spells, generally netting us at least 3 free spells and therefore 3 free procs off of Kellan every rotation. And then as our last enchantment, we have the scalable X spell Extraordinary Journey, which we can pump our considerable amount of mana into in order to both temporarily exile our opponent's creatures to clear the way for our flyers, and to slow down our opponents by forcing them to recast those creatures, and then sticks around as a payoff that draws us cards as creatures are cast or enter play from exile, including our opponent's creatures that we exiled with its first effect to help keep our hands nice and full. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. We have a trio of miscellaneous ways to cast spells from outside of our hands joining us as we enter our artifact category, those being the equipment, the Key to the Vault, which synergizes spectacularly with all our evasive creatures by letting us cast spells from our deck for free whenever the equipped creature gets in for damage, the Vehicle Deluxe Dragster, which is itself mostly unblockable so it can reliably get in for damage, and, when it does so, lets us cast instants and sorceries off our opponent's graveyards at no mana cost to net us even more non-traditional casting triggers and value off of the spells themselves, and, lastly, Riversong's Diary, which exiles instants and sorceries that any player plays, and, once it exiles enough, gives us the option to cast one of them for free at random for even more mana-less non-traditional spell casting for us and our commander to make use of. And then we have the Mana Rocks, Soul Ring, and Arcane Signet closing out our artifact arsenal, both of which provide the build with just a bit more ramp so we can get to our higher CMC spells that much faster. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. As the only Planeswalker we'll be running in this build, we have Jace Reawakened, which we'll be primarily using as a means for us to plot our CMC 3 or less spells so we can cast them for free on our next turn, but whose card selection can be situationally useful to help us dig for more spells to cast off Kellan if we have no spells to plot, and whose ultimate, if we can reach it, can absolutely flood the board with the gigantic permanents we're just waiting to cast from exile by letting us double up on them. That covers our singular Planeswalker, so let's move on to our land base. Quickly going over our mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower, Seaside Citadel, and Path of Ancestry, all of which tap for all 3 of our colors for added consistency, and the last one even providing reasonably frequent card selection as we cast our handful of humans and fairies, Exotic Orchard, which should be able to tap for most if not all of our colors off our opponent's lands for even more untapped fixing, the Czech lands Glacial Fortress, Hinterland Harbor, and Sunpetal Grove, along with the Reveal lands Port Town, Vineglimmer Snarl, and Fortified Village, all of which are duels that take advantage of our decently large selection of basic lands to come into play untapped, thereby providing us with reliable access to our colors without sacrificing speed to do so, and the Battle lands Canopy Vista and Prairie Stream, which again take advantage of our basics to come into play as untapped duels, but are also fetchable by our non-basic land ramp sources to further improve our build's consistency. And finally, we'll be running 6 plains, 9 islands, and 9 forests as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 9 cards with Adventure, 12 cards with or that can grant Foretell, 4 cards with Suspend, 4 cards with or that can grant Plot, 8 cards that let us cast spells from our deck, and 10 more cards that let us cast our or our opponent's spells non-traditionally in some fashion, giving us no shortage of ways to proc Kellan as frequently as possible to generate us the maximum possible value off of his ability, 7 cards that care about spells being cast from outside of our hands to net us even more value alongside our commander as we play into our primary game plan, and 16 creatures with either built-in evasion or trample to guarantee we'll be able to inflict reliable damage into our opponents while we generate all that value. For general deck stats, we have 20 ramp sources, 21 card draw sources, 12 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our ramp and draw being well above average in this build, both of which are due to the deck's multiple ways to cast free and discounted spells and or to get additional lands into play that already synergize perfectly with our commander's value-centric playstyle. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.81, which is actually faster than it may initially appear due to us being able to Adventure, Suspend, and Foretell quite a number of our spells at well below their base cost, leaving us with a build that aims to set up multiple spells in exile and or other ways to cast spells from outside of our hand initially, drop our commander, and then start generating value as we start casting those spells. Then from there, it's all about using that value to outpace our opponents, building up our board with evasive and trampling threats while we cast a torrent of spells for either free or at a discount, until our opponents simply fall before their inability to keep up with the value we generate, or are unable to block our arsenal of evasive and trampling beat sticks. Currently this deck is valued at $64.71, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we would like to side grade our deck in one direction or another without going over budget, we can consider trading out Deluxe Dragster and a Cemetery Illuminator for Guardian Naga and Horned Lock Whale, which give the build access to more disruption on big bodies for us to swing in with if we don't mind increasing our mana curve even more, or, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we can replace Glorious Protector with Savvy Trader, which gives us one less evasive body for us to cast from exile and protect our board with, but nets us another way to reduce the cost of all our non-traditionally cast spells that also provides us with one-time permanent recursion from our bin on top of that. Then, if we want to upgrade the build by going over budget, we can replace Twinning Twins with Railway Brawler as a moderate upgrade, which is a big trampling threat that we can cast from exile that makes all our other evasive and trampling threats twice as deadly by having them come in with +1/+1 counters equal to their power. Sapphire Dragon can be replaced with Chamil the Inner Sun as a more substantial upgrade, which passively discovers 5 on each of our end steps to continue providing us with a steady stream of free spells for us to take advantage of and to proc our commander with. And as our most significant upgrade, we can exchange out Cemetery Illuminator for Apex Devastator, whose quadruple cascade on ETB is fantastic at proccing our commander multiple times at once, and whose 10/10 body itself is a massive threat that our opponents have to deal with. And while I would normally complain about the price, we just received confirmation that it'll be reprinted in the Modern Horizons 3 Tricky Terrain Precon, which should hopefully bring down its current price to a more reasonable amount. Now if only WotC would do that for another overpriced green card. A man can dream. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, as some of you may already know, we've put our regularly scheduled polls on hold for the time being in anticipation of the Modern Horizons 3 Precon upgrades. But, in lieu of that, we're currently running the channel's 20k subscriber giveaway to celebrate us reaching the 20k subscriber milestone as of the posting of this video. So be sure to click on the link in the description so you can check out the deck we'll be giving away, learn how to enter, and see what upgrades we've unlocked and can be unlocked for it during the giveaway period. And if you're already subscribed to the channel, thank you so much for having helped us reach this point, as we would have been unable to do so without all of your support. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Consider donating to buy me a coffee or use my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to support the channel directly. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the deck text I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.